Good morning. You're listening to Retake Our Democracy, a 30-minute radio show that airs every Saturday morning at 8:30 a.m. on KSFR 101.1 FM, your Santa Fe public radio station. I'm Paul Gibson, the host of Retake Our Democracy. Today, we will be speaking with Jennifer Ramo, the founder and executive director of New Mexico Appleseed. An experienced attorney, Jennifer designed New Mexico Appleseed's system of change and created Appleseed's first in the nation programs such as Hunger-Free Students' Bill of Rights. I discovered New Mexico Appleseed while researching GBI pilots in New Mexico, or Guaranteed Basic Income pilots, of which Appleseed is sponsoring 4. We will get to Jennifer in just a minute to find out more about Appleseed, their GBI pilots, and other anti-poverty programs that they are developing. But first, a few announcements. Last week, I spoke with Augustine Montoya, the 22-year-old Democratic candidate for House of Representatives representing District 22. District 22 is a very conservative Republican district, currently represented by Stephanie Lord, a representative who never met a gun she didn't like. It was an inspiring interview, and you can meet Augie on September 8 at a 6 p.m. meet and greet hosted by Retake Our Democracy, Marielle Nanasi, and Jeff Haas. For information on the event, go to retakeourdemocracy.org and click on Actions and Events. It should appear near the top of the page. The week before last, I spoke with Dar Jamail, an internationally recognized climate author who says it is time to realize that we have not done our job and the worst of climate change is now inevitable. So our focus needs to shift to adaptation. We explored his thinking on this and what adaptation could look like at a national, regional, state, local, and personal level, and how he has decided to put his energy into local resilience and community building rather than national activism on climate. It was an extraordinary interview, and I highly recommend it. Dar's an amazing guy. I want to remind you that if you're driving around and miss any of today's show, you can watch the full YouTube recording of this show and any prior interview, including those with Dar and Augie, by going to retakeourdemocracy.org and clicking on the right side of the homepage for Retake on the Radio. And all of our YouTube recordings for all of our previous shows are listed in chronological order, so you can binge watch Retake radio shows for free. Retake is, I hope you have a bigger life than that. Retake is beginning to focus on the 2023 legislative session with a Zoominar series focusing on key issues we hope will become bills we will support in the 2023 legislative session. We kicked off the series last month with a discussion focused on gun violence prevention with Miranda Viscoli, co-president of New Mexicans to Prevent Gun Violence, and Janae Martinez, a student activist from Albuquerque. We discussed what might be possible in the 2023 legislative session by means of meaningful gun violence prevention legislation and how you can help. Later in July, we discussed modernizing the legislature with Representatives Angelica Rubio from Las Cruces and Cristina Ortiz from Taos. Also on the panel were Rick Ann Bach from Indivisible Santa Fe and Kara Lynch, co-founder of Legislative Momentum. There's a strong movement among a group of 10 Democratic women state House members to reform the New Mexico legislature with longer sessions, more paid staff, and paid legislators. We are the only state that doesn't pay our legislators. We learn why this reform is necessary and how differently the legislature could function if successfully modernized. You can view audio-video recordings of all of our Zoominars at retakeourdemocracy.org. Go to click on Actions and Events in the homepage banner, and you'll land on a page where at the top is a link to all of our Zoominars. On the Actions and Events page, you can also find out about our upcoming Zoominars, of which we have 2 scheduled. A Zoominar on health security in New Mexico on September 13th from 6 to 7:30, and on September 21st, just a week later, with the Alliance for Local Economic Prosperity, and we'll be discussing the public banking in New Mexico and that legislation and see how they're doing. Both of these can be links for those Zoominars can be found again on our Actions and Events page, and you must register to participate. We have Zoominars on guaranteed basic income, pilot projects, and public power slated for October. And you can always find out about that information at this page I just mentioned. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge that we are conducting the show on stolen Tewa land, and I want to thank our Tewa neighbors for being such good stewards of the land. We could learn a good deal from them about their custodial caring for the land, the water, and the air. Okay, let's meet Jennifer Romo and find out more about New Mexico Appleseed. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thanks. Jenny Ramo the is the name, but yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Okay. You even corrected me before we started. I'd like to let our guests introduce themselves. So Jennifer Ramo, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm Jenny Ramo. I grew up in Albuquerque. I have been devoted to public service really since the beginning. When I was a student in high school, I was interested in divestiture from South Africa. I volunteered, and I ended up going to law school and really seeing that the best path forward was to just change policies. And it's really become a passion of mine. And the more work I do on it, the more I see that how, first of all, how fundamentally flawed policies are that try to help people. How racist they are in their nature, and how little they actually help people. And so I founded Appleseed in 2009. It is part of a network of Appleseed centers that we're kind of loosely affiliated. That was started by the 1958, I think, class of Harvard Law School. Ralph Nader and others wanted to use their pro bono power to do systems change. They didn't want to just help the guy that got evicted, but they wanted to help the guy that look at the system of evictions. And so there are about maybe 17 or 18 centers all over, and we're very different. But Appleseed in New Mexico is really about collaboration, deep dive research, thoughtful, ethical behavior, and high impact systems change. We don't litigate, which I think is very helpful. There are wonderful organizations here, like Center on Law and Poverty, that do that work, and it enables us to kind of work in a different way, because it is hard to kind of sue CYFD on one call and then be trying to work with them collaboratively on another. So I think we have a really nice group of nonprofit legal policy organizations that work together with different competencies. And so ours is really about designing first of the nation policies that are high impact, that are replicable and scalable, and that really do help kind of give a basic needs foundation to the children in New Mexico and hopefully elsewhere. I think New Mexico Appleseed is a really important part of the ecosystem in New Mexico.
Okay. Well, I reached out to you to talk about your GBI programs, but in finding out more about your organization, I found that you have this program, Hunger Free Students Bill of Rights.
Yeah.
Can you briefly lay out what that program is about? I know that students just lost their free lunch across the country, I believe, because of legislation.
Yeah, so that's a little more, that's kind of a nuanced policy issue. But what I actually started Appleseed when I started in 2009, Albuquerque had made national news for giving kids lunch, cheese sandwiches for lunch when they owed money at the cafeteria. And there was this big group of advocates who were yelling and screaming and doing FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests. And it didn't fit my personality. And I also thought it was not productive. I thought that what I knew from being a lawyer was that there was actually no obligation legally for the schools to give the kids anything. And that while it certainly missed a sensitivity chip, they were trying to do something. And, we worked, it kind of really established our role of being kind of more thoughtful and less bomb throwing advocates that I think has been effective. It took a long time to come to the conclusion that what we needed was a law to handle it. And so the issue is, if kids owe money at the cafeteria, or their parents owe money at the cafeteria, or they don't have any money that day and they're not eligible for free meals, then they rack up a debt. And generally it depends on the district, but they can either rack up a debt and at a certain point they start giving them nothing or a cheese sandwich, or they just don't even allow them to rack up a debt. And what we said that made international news, cover the New York Times, CNN, was no matter what, you have to keep the debt between the grown-ups and feed the kid the same meal that you give everybody else. So that everyone needed to, that there was no other debt collection process really that involved taking food from children. And I I don't know how many other states have done it now, but it was really just a kind of, after trying everything, to work collaboratively with districts, there was, the only way to do it was to ban it, and so we banned it. We have a federal law too, federal bill coming in that can't be as strong, because the more conservative members of the government do not, of the legislative body, don't want to have to pay for those meals. So I mean, really, they should just be giving the kids meals for free in the whole country as they did during COVID. I mean, it just makes more sense. Takes away a lot of the administrative burden, but this
And
was
the
really a
stigma.
statement. Yeah, the stigma, the whole thing was horrible. I mean, these kids were like, A, they're hungry. They literally have no food at home. B, they're going to spend their whole morning worried about getting lunch or what's going to happen. And C, they're just humiliated. And so it seemed like a natural, we had no idea the impact it was going to have, and in terms of press. And I'm glad we highlighted just a teeny issue. I mean, the one thing I will say that's kind of funny is when I was on like BBC, or, they had this international outrage about it. I was like, oh, you think this is bad? Lunch shaming is nothing compared to what we have kids in cages at the moment. So let's be outraged about, let's not limit our outrage to this, this insult.
Yeah, yeah. Well, what other programs have been developed by Appleseed, and is your system of change the unifying thread?
I think it is. So we are, I mean, I think our organization is a little more entrepreneurial than most. I mean, I really pride myself on being able to connect the dots and see a path forward. So we've had several first in the nation initiatives. So first was breakfast after the bell, which I will tell you in a separate, kind of in a separate paragraph, has been an incredibly difficult problem in terms of having the schools pay attention to what the law says. But it said all high poverty elementary schools had to serve breakfast in the first 3 minutes of class. And we have received over the years incredible pushback from the teachers union, incredible pushback from some of the legislative members. But it really is an evidence-based program that shows that if you make breakfast available to all the kids for free, there's no stigma, everybody eats, and they do better, their outcomes are better. And the evidence of that, I mean, there are studies, but also when it's testing time in schools, you see that they give the kids breakfast. So that was one first in the nation, and that's everywhere now. The second first in the nation was that we created a really interesting model with the Navajo Nation that received a USDA innovation grant, that used community members to expand school meals and create kind of a microeconomy so that they could have local beef be the beef, the protein requirement, local vegetables be the vegetable requirement, and creating these microeconomies where the beef guy needs the delivery guy, he needs the car repair guy. And so that's been very interesting. And then the lunch shaming law was our other first in the nation. But we've really started to see, I think, of policymaking, and really speaks to our kind of theory of change, as a Rube Goldberg machine. And for those who are not familiar with Rube Goldberg, everyone under my age in my office looks at me with a blank stare when I say Rube Goldberg, but it's a chain reaction machine. And what I realized early on in my work was, if you just focus on one part of the chain reaction machine and yours is great, but everything else is failing, then what you do is irrelevant. And so we've really taken on this role of kind of trying to reverse engineer the Rube Goldberg machine so that it's around, starts and ends with the families who need the help. And that and that we are watchdogs and policymakers, and we make sure that we zoom out and see how the whole system is working and not working, and try to fix it at every part, which means sometimes we have a local fix, sometimes we have a state fix, sometimes we have a tribal fix, and sometimes we have a federal fix. And sometimes it's just even a fix of changing people's hearts and minds through having a better understanding. But so I think our method of change, which is deep legal research, policy research, two of us are lawyers, deep community commitment and partnerships, and really a notion that collaboration is not only key, but it's unethical to not collaborate, that you really have to work with other people. You can't just sit in your office and opine.
Okay. Well, that's what I do. I opine.
Yeah, you
It's
opine. Yeah.
it's interesting because when we talked before, what you do, your firm, your organization is very similar to the organization I founded 40 years ago in the Bay
Cool.
Area. And what we did was we'd go into a school district or a county office, a health department, and we'd ask them about what their major issues are, and then we'd back map how they,
Perfect.
we'd unpack the whole thing, like
Yeah.
where does this start, and what is the systemic fix that needs to occur, and then we do research on what other health departments had done and
Perfect.
find
Yeah, exactly.
evidence-based practice, which didn't have a term, wasn't a term then. It's
Right.
not like we coined it, but
Right.
I think a bunch
It
of
wasn't, probably
research.
wasn't being applied at that time. It was probably only being applied in medicine and science, and not
Mhm.
in this work.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, we tried to apply it to everything we did, and it was our
Yes,
method.
that's the answer. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that, let me just say one more thing that we're doing here that is along those lines, which is we created the Family Success Lab at the Department of Health, which is now really getting hopefully some funding from the state, but it is entirely about evidence-based policymaking and saying, let's bring all the administrative data together to see what are the patterns, like of all the children that disappear and die of child abuse, how many of them have the same data story? Can we see what the risk factors are for child maltreatment or poor educational outcomes just from the administrative data? And it's an integrated data set that is for research, and of all the people that are getting home visiting, does the home visiting help the older kids in the household? I mean, what if the dad is, if failing third grade reading is a risk factor, is sorry, excuse me, if your dad is in prison is a risk factor for failing third grade reading? We don't know that. And so that the Family Success Lab is another piece of Appleseed's work that I think will lead to dramatic systems change in New Mexico.
I had that as a question later, so thank you for getting to it.
Yeah. I
Um,
also have ESP, so that, yeah.
it's a good thing. All right, we need to take a quick break here just to remind our listeners that you're listening to KSFR, and it's at times like these, with so much misinformation out there on the news and in social media, that a news source such as KSFR, where you get straight news, facts, good programming on New Mexico culture and music and history, and interview programs like this one, it's so important in these times of misinformation. So if you've got some spare change, when you get done listening to the show, go to ksfr.org and click on the donate button and toss them 10, 20, $30 and look at it as your ticket for admission to some really good programming. And on behalf of KSFR, I want to thank you in advance. So we have been talking with Jennifer Ramo.
So close.
So close, yeah.
You'll get it by the end of this. I believe in you.
Okay,
Yeah,
all
well,
right.
most people know my dad. That's usually how they get is Dr. Barry Ramo on TV. So usually that's the connection that gets people the pronunciation. But it probably was Ramo at some point.
Okay, well, we'll get there. And we've talked about a number of programs that Appleseed has initiated, but we sort of skipped past the GBI, the
Yeah.
Guaranteed Basic Income programs, and that was the original intent of the conversation. So let's talk about that. You've got 4 pilots in New Mexico. Where are they located? Who do they serve? And what impact did they achieve?
So let me back up and talk a little bit about GBI in general. So there's a huge amount of research that's been done by the World Bank and Esther Duflo, who's at MIT at the Jamil Abdul Latif Poverty Action Lab, University of Chicago, who we work with a lot, about just giving people money. And it's the most obvious, simple, straightforward surgical solution to poverty. And a lot of the systems change that's happened, or systems work that's happened, is assuming that what people need is to be told how to use their money. and it's very infantilizing. And it turns out that not only from a kind of outside of being insulting, it actually doesn't work to tell people. The evidence base really shows that if you give people cash, they use it well, and they use it in the way that they prioritize, and they, by most standards, improve their lives, whether their own standards or an objective standard. So what happened was when COVID hit, one of our funders, Western Sky Community Care, just said, what would you do with this money? And I said, well, our big focus is homeless students, because it turns out that housing inadequacy, is the driver for everything bad. And we also knew the kids were disengaged from school because COVID was, it was all remote. So we started with 2 pilots, one in Albuquerque and one in Las Cruces, with I think about 84 kids. And we paid the kids to engage in academic intervention. So what's called a conditional cash transfer. So the cash transfer, by definition, they can use the money however they want. It's not a cash transfer if there's any restriction on how they use the money, but you can have a condition on what they do to get the money. And for the most part, those are not, it's not how you want to do business, is, attach a condition to people getting basic needs money. But there, and we consulted an ethicist about this. But what we discovered was that because kids need to go to school anyway, and this can be an incentive, it really didn't kind of go into unethical territory to say, we're going to pay you to go to school. We're going to say you can have this money if you go to school. So what we had is these 2 original pilots that they had to go to tutoring over this. They were summer pilots, tutoring. I think it was socio-emotional support, and it was only maybe 2 or 3 month pilots, and they got $500. And it wasn't enough. It wasn't structured enough to have any evidence, but the qualitative data really showed that the kids felt better about themselves and wanted to participate. So then we went to when those pilots ended, we wrote them up, and they were very messy. It was the first time we'd ever done it. We're not social scientists. We are, policy people, but we did learn a lot about, and we had a great, it just strengthened our relationship with the homeless communities, kind of support systems. And then we went to the Lanel Foundation and said, hey, I think this is really important work. And Lanel gave us money to do 2 pilots, one in Cuba, ISD, and actually you should have their superintendent is one of my favorite people ever, Karen Sanchez Gallego, and then West Las Vegas. And we decided that we asked for enough money to make sure we covered all the kids who were what's called McKinney-Vento homeless, which is a federal law that says if you have any type of housing inadequacy, you're considered homeless in the educational setting. So like if you don't have lights, you can't do your homework. If you don't have running water, if your house is inadequate, if you're bouncing around from house to house, or you're actually technically homeless, those all are in the same triggering factors for McKinney-Vento coverage. So we ended up deciding that it would be McKinney-Vento students in those 2 districts who were in high school, and that they would be paid $500 a month for basically 8 months. And they would have to turn in 90% of their homework. So this was all remote, attend 90% of their days, attend tutoring, and then be available for some sort of socio-emotional support. We paid the districts each about $40,000 to pay for tutors, and this was all Lanel money, and to pay for tutors, and having the McKinney-Vento coordinators go out to the community and into their go out because everyone was at home and check in on them. And you'll have to see, I don't remember any exactly, but we had I think an 80% retention rate. Almost all the kids stayed. Both the districts and the kids felt like it motivated them to do the work. They felt good about it. From the district's perspective, they improved their grades, they improved their attendance, and that overall they improved their kind of closeness with their students, that bond felt a little stronger. And so both districts, we really feel like it was a success in the project itself and added to the evidence base of this the whole world of should you just give people money? And I think it's really important. And we're now in the process of starting designing another pilot.
Yeah, I have a question for that a little bit later.
Okay.
So I wanted to also ask you, in preparing for the interview, you sent me a piece from Insight about why all guaranteed income is narrative work. And I think the conversation we just had is a good segue into this. It described how false narratives that have become core to our American identity shape policymaking or limit policymaking. You specifically, or not you, but the Insight, the publication, specifically identified two false narratives as being particularly harmful. Let's talk about each of them. The first was bootstrap self-made man myth. What is it about that myth, and why is it such a misleading narrative, and why is dismantling it so important to passing economic justice or anti-poverty legislation?
That's a big ask to explain all of that, but I will do my best. I'm certainly not an expert on racial equity, but really, when you look at, I think what this idea is based on the corollary, actually, is that people who haven't done it haven't gotten out of poverty is because they're lazy. And what happens, I think, is that the 1% that escape poverty get this kind of bootstrap prize, and as if they were the only reason they got out was because they tried hard. And I think it's so toxic and so inaccurate, and it's not based in any evidence that people are lazy. And in fact, when you look at the benefit cliffs that people who do a little bit better, if you do a little bit better, you lose a lot of your benefits. I mean, people are actively punished for doing better or saving. So whether or not it almost doesn't matter if it's race.
Jennifer,
Yeah.
Jennifer Ramo.
Yeah.
I got it right. End of the radio
Yeah.
show. So we're going to have to pause here for the
Okay.
rates, and I'm going to have to close the show. But before
Okay.
I do, I want you to tell our listeners where they can find out more information about New Mexico
Sure.
Appleseed.
Well, thank you for having me. It's nmappleseed.org, and we have a bunch of reports and interesting videos. And, like everyone else, we are funded by donors. But thank you for having me. And we're always happy to come back.
And we're going to continue this conversation on Retake on the radio. You'll be able to see that. So if you're driving around, if you're listening to this now, this will be posted on the website before the show actually airs. So you'll be able to see the whole thing. And so thank you for joining us. We'll be back next week with another guest. And please stay safe, stay healthy, and above all, stay active. It's the only way we fix this mess. And it's a mess. Thank you. And thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Okay, we're back on YouTube now, and I'm talking with Jennifer Ramo and pronouncing her name correctly. So you were describing the bootstrap thing, and it's of course connected with the whole, Protestant ethic, and if you work hard, you succeed, and so forth. So it's ingrained in this kind of Christian theology that is so much a part of American culture. And so as you had just pointed out, the corollary to that, or the reverse of that, is that if you're not doing well, you must be flawed morally or character, or you're not trying, which would be a flaw in character. And that just doesn't happen to be the case. And that's completely obscuring any focus on the systemic issues that contribute to people not succeeding. So that's one of the myths that the Insights described. The second is millennial women. You want to comment on how the false narrative about millennial women, and how does it undermine gender-based and family-focused policymaking?
I have no idea what that is. I haven't heard that one. What are they saying about millennial women? I'm older than a millennial, so I really don't know.
Well, it's basically, that the woman can do it all. They're going to take care of everything at home. They can work, and there's no impediments to their success.
Right.
And it's like Superwoman.
Right.
and
Which is a
uh,
very unreasonable expectation.
right. And
Yeah.
so that's another myth and that they don't need help or supports. And so I highly recommend the Why All Guaranteed Income is Narrative work, because what the article pointed out was that if we're going to ever make systemic changes, first we have to change the cultural view of poverty and just dissect it from this sense of that if you're poor, you deserve it, and you're a moral failure or an ethical failure. So, but I definitely recommend that article, and I wrote about it in a blog very recently that you can get on our website. A separate but related narrative I hear from the business community is it is hard enough to recruit employees, give away money for nothing, and these folks will never want to seek a job. How would you counter that narrative?
I'm not even sure what it's about. And maybe give me a little bit more meat to that. Basically, the worse you treat your employees, the more they want it. I'm not sure. I mean, I don't even know whose bad business idea that is, but we find, you know, I think people need to have a living wage. And I don't know how. I mean, we did some study that I think, I don't remember the numbers, but I mean, a huge percentage of just state public employees do not make a living wage. In some of our pilots, we've had people who were homeless, technically homeless, who had full-time jobs with their districts. And so I think that's part of dismantling this myth, that if you are in a job all day, you're fine. I also think people don't know how insufficient the social safety net is in terms of public welfare. I mean, the only real cash transfer that is TANF, and temporary assistance for needy families, and that's very time limited. So there really isn't a way to get cash. And part of our systems change work is really, again, reverse engineering that Rube Goldberg machine, so that, for example, for WIC, to get, when they're working on this, the federal law, but to WIC, you have to get your kids, anyone you want covered, in a car to the WIC clinic to get certified. You can't get certified online, and or you might be able to during COVID, but generally you could not. And then they make you give a blood sample, which I find draconian and insane, with the idea that they're checking people's diet and whether or not they have lead poisoning from their homes. Well, it's not like they're doing anything. They make that, at least don't make that a requirement. But the number of obstacles we put in front of people getting just basic needs met makes it impossible to do anything.
So I asked you earlier, or we talked a little bit earlier about the Family Success Lab at the New Mexico Department of Health, and I'm wondering, would this be what are some of the kinds of projects that they're taking on right now, and what could they do in the future?
Well, I will tell you all, I think, so the point is to look at the whole family. There's this Venn diagram of the most complicated, most at risk, most vulnerable, probably most in pain families. If you look at the whole family, so maybe dad is in corrections, mom has mental health and substance abuse issues, but everyone has poor educational outcomes, they're housing inadequate, they go to the ER. And if you look at the middle of that, that's kind of the most vulnerable, most expensive families. So that's about 16,000 families in New Mexico, costing like $900 million a year. And if you pull the Venn diagram apart, it's really all the different agencies that deal with these different items. So mental health, and if they're even dealing with education, corrections, and they don't share data for research purposes, and they don't coordinate efforts. And so one of the first order of businesses for the Family Success Lab is just literally creating a family in data so that they can see. We don't even have an unduplicated account across agencies, who's in CYFD, who's in criminal, who's in PEV. We don't have even that, but first order of business really is creating the data family. And then, you're asking research questions. So there's a big push to get family home visiting for newborns. Well, so if there's home visiting newborns, how does that impact the kid itself? But also, what about other people in the family? We also have that. I mean, not only can we see, so they're asking those types of questions is, what interventions are we doing has a domino effect, but you also want to make sure you're not doing any damage, which is another important piece of this is, did we do something that we thought was good and actually ended up really undermining families?
Yeah, do no harm.
Yeah.
So Retake is interested in supporting legislation that would allocate state funding to facilitate launching and studying more GBI projects targeting different populations. Is this something that could reasonably be housed in the Family Success Lab?
No, the Family Success Lab is really about research, but they would be participating in terms of designing and designing interventions for evaluation, because you really do need the evaluator as part of at least a part of the design team if you can. And so that you're making sure you're setting up in your theory of change, like, okay, what do we want to see happen here? And is that measurable? I don't think they would run it. I think many, I think I explained to you on the phone, Appleseed doesn't take any public dollars, just we keep our hands clean. But there are a lot of organizations that could be running GBI programs. I mean, I love that Sherry Hooper over at the Food Depot. And we haven't discussed this, but I've always wanted to see like what would happen if for like 50% of her clients, they gave like $200 and what like $500, whatever it is, like there would be so many interesting things to see, like how they spent it. Did it help? Did it, what's an appropriate amount? But there are a million places who could run GBI programs. The wrinkle is really not doing harm when you do it. That's what's so scary. We're working with the University of Chicago to design our new our new basic income, which is mothers of caregivers of babies who were born drug exposed. And we want to design it with them, with women with lived experience. Like, how much do they need? What would they do with the money? What would be a helpful amount? How often do they need it? And kind of doing a community-based participatory research-ish model, and trying to then implement it so that we're giving these caregivers, whether it's the grandparents or the moms or a cousin, the right amount of money and plus the supportive services that they need, which is called a cash transfer plus is the name for that, to make sure that they are able to do that. But there's so many curious, interesting, awesome people in New Mexico working on these issues, and there's no shortage of people who could run these. The question is how you do it, making sure there's an ethical review and making sure that there's someone with the research evaluation expertise involved. Otherwise,
You're giving away money.
Yeah, which is fine too,
Right,
but you're not
you're not going to learn anything from it.
Right. Well, one when you going back to your bootstrap thing, what we encounter is, why are you giving people free money and they have to do something with it? Why don't they do something for it? And so even somebody to counter that, I think, is an important piece.
So I had hoped that Appleseed would be a good organization to house a GBI pilot incubator. But in talking to you, and you just mentioned this yourself, you don't accept government funds. What is the source for that reluctance to accept government funds?
It's just a cleaner conversation. So we do quite a bit of work for every administration. We work kind of in behind the scenes. We crafted a large amount of Governor Lou Hungresham's hunger strategies, their homeless strategies. We kind of work in the background, and that's what our donor dollars are for. We would rather not get paid. I think that just changes the dynamic, and it changes our ethical obligations. It makes them more challenging. So, for example, we're having a lot of trouble getting breakfast after the bell enforced, and we want to be able to be advocates and not have a conflict of interest, that we have a contract. We want to make sure that whatever advocacy strategies we need to utilize are available and not limited by a conflict.
Okay, that makes sense. Unfortunately, we're going to still have to hunt around and find agency to host one of these programs.
Well, we could do it. We just need private money, or we needed to go through something else. But yes, UNM actually would also be interesting.
Okay, all right. So the California Guaranteed Income Pilot Program was established to provide grants to eligible entities for the purpose of administering pilot programs and projects that provide a guaranteed income to participants. Can you tell us a bit more about the California experience and whether or not New Mexico could learn something from California in their adoption of GBI pilots?
So I'm not familiar with that legislation, but there are great communities of practice with the GBI community that we're all kind of learning at the same time. There's one in San Francisco that is going through Pacific Island. I forget what exactly it is, but there's a great one happening that is, I think, different from Other Mothers, but that they're doing through Berkeley. And they have actually spent so long designing it, I don't think they've implemented it yet, which is one of the dangers of going into this with an academic institution is you just are stuck. But I think it's the realization that what we're doing in terms of just having any money attached to services, having this money so loaded with requirements that it's better to just give people money, I think it is clearly catching on, from Andrew Yang to, who certainly didn't invent it, but it seems to be catching on. And so I hope New Mexico does expand their work.
The model I'm familiar with from Scandinavia, they give $1,000 a month. I haven't seen any programs giving $1,000 a month, and maybe there are.
Yeah, there are.
But a lot of them are at the 200 and particularly in New Mexico, $200, $500 at the most. And to what do you attribute that smaller amount?
Usually just how much your grant is for. I mean, that's for us, is like, we've decided to have two communities, Cuba and West Las Vegas, and give kids a meaningful amount for their community, $500 a month. There was nothing scientific about it. And part of what we're going to do with this program with the mothers, the babies who were born with substance exposure, is work with them to find out what the appropriate amount is. The other challenge is that if you want to have any evidence-based anything, you need a sizable population to study. And so it's hard if you give $10,000 to two families versus $500 to more families, then you just have a smaller population to study. It's a little harder to draw conclusions.
Okay. Well, I haven't seen, do you know a source for, I know there's a lot of organizations that have been organized around this. There's a mayor's organization that initiates these things. That's where Santa Fe got started with this. But I haven't found a lot of good outcome data anywhere.
The best place, and I will tell you, I am obsessed. I want to have a BFF necklace with Esther Duflo. So Esther Duflo is at MIT, and I think I mentioned it earlier. It's the JPAL, so Jamil Abdul Latif Poverty Action Lab. And she and her husband and another guy won the Nobel Prize in 2019 for behavioral economics. And so they are very well versed in cash transfer pilots and have a lot of studies that they've released. The other place that we do work with is Chapin Hall at University of Chicago. And they are doing one right now with homeless students in New York City. And they co-designed it with the homeless students.
I think that's just great. Imagine that, actually asking people what they need rather than presuming you know what they need.
Yeah. But it's wild to peel that off, even for well-intentioned people. You're like, well, of course you need this. Like, to really ask without anything that you contribute is hard. To truly make them the experts it takes a lot of self-discipline, even for those of us who are just well-intentioned. You're like, well, of course you want this. I mean, a great example is this substance exposed babies thing is we want to have two sets of outcomes. One is the outcomes that the caregivers themselves decide on, and then the other is more administrative data, did it reduce CYFD involvement? Did it, did the kids' grades go up in the older kids? But you realize almost the administrative data has so much garbage in it and racist questions, and just that the real answer honestly is in the qualitative data. when it comes down to it, is people's lived experience is probably more valuable than, when you're looking at outcomes for one of these, deciding what the outcomes are for the cash transfer pilot, like CYFD, reducing CYFD interactions. How do they even decide who they interact with anyway? Is it because you have tattoos, you have brown skin? So the more we do this, the more we want to just kind of work with the individual and let them tell us what they need.
Well, but and you're saying that most of the data that's most important data is this qualitative data. And in working with the legislature, I'm not sure being told that 80% students
Yeah.
receiving or families receiving $500 a month
Totally.
felt that $500 helped them, and that they felt more financially secure.
Totally.
I mean, that's just, they want to see.
Well, and you can't, we dealt with this when we were creating the Family Success Lab, like, is there a garbage in, garbage out problem? And how do you do that? And there is enough data, but I think administrative data is incredibly important, especially when you're trying to like remove dogma so that you can say, this intervention, home visiting for, substance abuse babies, improved attendance for the older kids. And that if you have enough data to make that conclusion, then I think those are safe conclusions to make. And we always have to deal with that. We have two constituents. One is the legislature, who wants to hear exactly your point, which is they want to hear, we saved $1 billion. And usually that's actually there because it does save $1 billion. But you do have to, when I think about like where my heart lies in trying to re-engineer the Rube Goldberg machine so that you're empowering people in a community, what they think matters. And I think it's been largely discarded as kind of just opinion, but you have to be able to do both. I think you have a great point.
Okay. All right. Well, we're well into a Saturday afternoon. We're recording this on Saturday before it's going to air. So I want to let Jennifer get back to her family.
Thank you.
And
Thank
you very much for carving out Saturday afternoon for this. And appreciate it very much. And if you want to tell people who maybe didn't write it down earlier, where can people get more information about New Mexico Appleseed?
Sure, we have a great website and you can sign up for our email, and we don't actually email that often, but it's NM, like New Mexico, nmappleseed.org, nmappleseed.org.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jennifer.
Thank you
Have
for
a
having
great
me.
Saturday. Okay.
You too. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.